World's on fire. Yours? Well, this week I have a rabbit hole, and I started connecting the dots for this one because there was a banned book that I read in high school, and there's also a social psychology study that I learned about that essentially both are categorized as unethical. Both carry heavy explorations of human nature and group formation. And the issue in terms of the book was more of like its depiction of violent behavior in 11 to 12-year-old boys. And the reason why this study is labeled as unethical is kind of a bit more complicated than I bargained for when I started reading it, because I was like, why are people upset about this? But we'll get there. You should know that this whole thing is going to be a mess. If you've opened up my channel, I just pick apart the messiest parts of these experiments. But for this one, the year is 1954, and a social psychologist named Muzafer Sherif had been conducting like a series of different research experiments on group development for about a decade. He wanted to understand like conflict between groups, especially when they form attitudes together, and what the attitudes of one group can do to affect another, if that makes sense. So in this experiment especially, he wanted to see how possible it was to identify like general factors that influence group behavior outside of social class, race, and intercontinental conflict. And this study took place in like 3 different phases, where in each of the phases he kind of ramped up what was going on. So phase 1, he stressed the importance of researching outside of the laboratory environment. A lot of social experiments at the time, a lot of experiments in general took place in laboratory environments for researchers to control literally every aspect of something. And they weren't going to get down to the bottom of what they wanted to see if they were pushing certain formal directions onto participants, or if they were putting external pressure onto the participants to act a certain way. So he thought, why not gather up a group of about 20 prepubescent, middle-class, educated, Protestant white boys that were raised with similar values and 2-parent households, and just toss them into a summer camp where they can do camp stuff and they won't know that we're there. And once we have them there, like, we let them become best buddies, we can separate them and we can see what happens, all in the name of social science, whatever. And the reason why he chose this particular type of child, because all of these kids, they weren't in school together, they were strangers. That was the biggest thing too, is he wanted them all to be strangers, but strangers with very homogenous, like, specific traits. So he wanted to remove like the influences of things like disability, lack of access, unstable home lives, prior life experience. I mean, you're 12, you don't really have that much going on as far as your life experience, but you're starting to form bigger connections about groups and your place within them. So it was kind of an interesting group of people to use, but he also wanted to break down all of the different influences that might influence the environment that he's trying to create. So this 3-week-long summer camp started off really simple, to be honest, because they had it set up exactly like a summer camp. So he and his team, I don't know if they rented it out or what they did, but there is a real camp, real national park. It's called Robbers Cave. And they took the boys to Robbers Cave for 3 weeks. And the boys didn't know that they were being studied again, because everything was in the context of all of the activities that they did there. So they got to go hiking, they got to go swimming, they got to go hunting, gathering, tug of war, whatever it was, they got to do it. And the boys did pretty well. They became bunkmates, they all enjoyed each other's company, and they even told the camp counselors which one of the campers were like their best buds. They were so excited. And they felt like they were gonna be game for anything that these next 3 weeks had for them. Like, the camp counselors were there, they were being so supportive. They were like, yeah, what are you guys gonna do? What are you guys gonna do? You're so sorry. Knowing what they're gonna do to these kids and like how they're gonna be a mess, or like they feel like reality TV producers as I was reading this, because I'm also following the Love Island mess to escape from world, but whatever. So the boys felt like they were at the best summer camp ever. They didn't know that they were being watched and recorded, but the researchers were pretending enough to be camp staff in this study, and they were paying attention to kids' behaviors, and they were trying to see how these groups are going to form, and how they're going to react once we really get into it. So the next part of this is, it's still phase 1, by the way, but the next part of phase 1 is, after a few days, he reshuffles the groups. He's like, all right, I'm gonna take you from a group of 20 kids to 2 groups of 10, and then we're going to do something else. So he purposefully split the boys who said that they were best buds apart from each other. He was like, this has to stop, goodbye. And he says what it's for, right? He says that it's just, he doesn't want kids that already like really like each other to be on the same thing. But I feel like he did it just for the drama of it all, of like these kids, you know how it was like being that young, like anybody was your friend technically, but if you had at least 3 things in common, y'all were best buds. It was everything. And here he was like, I don't care. I don't want to hear anything. I don't want to hear anything. Everybody shut up. So he kept them as far as possible and split them off into different groups. And the boys, understandably, were like super upset about that. So to calm them down from any more of an emotional response, he let the teams go out on a hike. And on that hike, they got to know each other. And he was really smart about it, because he said that this small section of the study already shows that strangers that are placed in a common activity start to make like spontaneous and super informal organization about how they do things. So like, no matter what, a group is going to have a leader. No matter what, a group is going to start delegating tasks. You're going to weed out who is the most, in this case, resourceful, or you're going to weed out who, is not the best for the group. You can also see unwritten norms develop, like unwritten rules that an outside group maybe wouldn't understand, but all of the boys in their camp do get, So they all started to develop like a sense of camaraderie really quickly. They all became friends again. And it didn't take too long for them to start picking out their leaders and start doing what was best for the group and moving as a group. And the stronger, more resourceful kids of the group were kind of like the leader and the lieutenants and whatever. And the kids that were at the bottom of the rank kind of had to either fight to show their worth, or not like fighting, but like, socially had to fight to show their worth, or, pull their weight even more because they didn't want to be weeded out as the lesser part of the group. And then by the time they got settled, they created flags. Like they were on the up and up again. They were like, hell yeah. Like this is our team. Ain't nobody telling us anything. We don't know what they have going on over there, but that's okay because we're good. And they came up with like t-shirts. They had t-shirts, they had flags, they had banners. They were ready for anything. And and they split off into the Eagles and the Rattlers. That's where phase 2 kind of starts. Once phase 2 starts, it gets to the point where the Eagles and the Rattlers are sat down and they're told, hey, for the next week, y'all are gonna have a series of competitions. Y'all are gonna have a series of competitions where each of you gets team points and a trophy at the end of this. You're gonna get a trophy at the end of this. They were also given chances to win individual prizes during these things. Like some kids got pocket knives. Some kids got an individual trophy. Some kids got a dessert. Like it was a whole different thing. And the losers didn't get anything. They were on a no participation trophy rules. They didn't care. So the boys immediately were ready to rock. They were like, oh, okay, sure. Competition? Flag football? Okay, I can do this. And instead of them remembering their friendships that they had with the kids on the other side, they didn't care. They didn't care anymore. The competition was everything. So they saw each other's flags after that and immediately started trash talking it. Like, oh, whatever. I don't care about your flag. And the Rattlers in general were like the menaces. They were like the menace group, which I'll get more into later, but they were the menace group. And they said, actually, you couldn't tell any Rattler anything because they heard that announcement of the competition. They said, we're the best, we're winning, we're taking over. We're taking over. When they got dismissed from that little briefing, I guess, they went around threatening every single member of the Eagles, not the band. They went around threatening every single Eagle they came across, telling them what would happen if they burned the Rattler flag. So on top of all the competition talk, like Sherif and his team were starting to set up scenarios where like one group would get perks and the other group wouldn't get anything. Or if a group did get a perk, they would get it at the expense of the other team, which in some of the scenarios is funny, and in other ones it's not as funny. Like I came across this article where they were talking about how they would tell both teams, hey, we have a picnic coming up, show up at this time. And the boys would show up learning that a team was already there before them and had eaten all of the food, like even their portions of food, like they ate all of it and they didn't have anything left. So he started like ramping up the pace. He would still feed them, by the way. He wasn't just letting these kids starve, but he was getting them to the point where like, if we start having things like them actually fighting for resources, then what are they going to do about it? By the time the competition started, especially after that whole picnic incident, the Eagles said, so Rocket, you don't want us to burn your flag? They burned the Rattlers flag. On day one, they said, okay, yeah, I'm burning your flag. The second day, the Rattlers matched that energy, went into the Eagles' cabin and ransacked it. They tore the entire thing apart. After that, the boys were constantly in conflict with one another. Like, there were daily raids. There were a whole lot of yelling at each other because they wanted to win. They were trying to knock the other team down by telling them they're trash, they ain't nothing, they don't have anything going for them. And one group leader, Sherif and his team didn't name which of the kids was upset about this, but one of the group leaders was replaced because he just couldn't hack it. He was stressed out. This poor boy, he was stressed out and couldn't take being in constant conflict and contest with the other boys. He was still in the experiment, but he had to step down from his leadership thing. And the opposite group, and I'm gonna let y'all guess which one, because I couldn't figure out which one it was. But I have an idea. Just after reading about all of their behavior, I have an idea. But one of the groups, essentially, a new leader emerged, right? He emerged because at first he wasn't really doing much of anything. When everything was all copacetic and they were just split in different teams, he wasn't really doing anything or contributing, but he was the biggest bully when it came to like the lunch line and just being rude to other kids. And for whatever reason, once this chaos began, he just rose to the top of the ranks as like, as it became clear that like he was just going to be an agent of chaos. I mean, there's no other way to really put it, but that's what they did. And it became really clear that morale and cooperativeness and everything like that in the groups was strong, but when the boys were interacting with each other, they weren't as democratic or cooperative with people on the outside of the group. And it then had to move into phase 3 because it couldn't stay at phase 2 with them being gladiators with one another. They had to be split up and like do something else. So with all of the division that Sherif and his team created, like they placed the boys in urgent situations that eventually would challenge them. And the point of that was to use the boys in this stage to test a different hypothesis that they were making about real world groups. So in the real world, groups can kind of act harmonious with one another if they have a compelling goal that is beneficial for more than one group that can't be completed without you leaning on the other group to do, if that makes sense. So for this type of situation, they would do things like break the water supply, take the boys' food away, or say that the food truck was in a ditch or something like that. Like they would do all sorts of things to get these boys riled up and, you know, shaken just to see what they would do and if they would come together as a group. So in the first one, when they announced that the water supply was messed up because of a missing or broken pipe, immediately boys from both teams volunteered to go look at the water line together. And they wanted to check out the problem. Meanwhile, a few hours later, the researchers found out that they didn't even need to be there because the boys had fixed the problem by later on in the afternoon. They had worked together to just solve the problem. No issues. Were they still bickering and things like that? Sure, but there were still no issues with that. And then on a different occasion, the boys asked if they could watch a movie. So both teams were like, hey, we want to watch something. Let's go ask if we can rent a movie. And Sherif told them, like, no, we don't have the budget. We don't have the budget to take you to the movies. So we're not doing it. But the boys on both teams, the Eagles and the Rattlers, they got together and they crowdfunded, like whatever pocket change these boys had, they crowdfunded, they voted together, and then gave Sherif the money and told him what movie they wanted to rent. Then they all, like once they finally rented the movie, they all went and they sat together without animosity. Like they were super calm. And to these kids' credit, they were smart as hell because the researchers weren't directly telling them what to do about the situation. They were just telling them the situation, and they would always collectively come back together anytime Sherif and his team would throw something at them. There were like other situations too that I'm not really going to list, But I think that the story of them renting the movie and the very first experiment he did where he broke their water supply really shows like not only how groups work together, but it says a lot about the environment that these kids were brought up in, which I'll kind of talk about a little bit more. But they still bickered and they would still shove each other. They were still like age appropriate kids. But they didn't have that same level of like vim anymore that they did when they were going through phase 2, which was them competing against each other. So they didn't really care about that anymore. It wasn't that important. And the boys began to finally like have friendships across groups. And over time, like they stopped referring to members of the other groups just as their group name. So they stopped saying, hey, you Rattler, or hey, you Eagle, blah, 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 blah. They just started using each other's names, and they would actively start seeking each other out across teams to hang out with each other and just talk. And by the time the camp was over, the boys were really no longer split up from each other. They would still go to like their separate cabins or whatever, but when they were physically together, they wouldn't be as, there wasn't as clear as a divide as it was for the other one. And it just, I don't know. It's just really cute to hear about the fact that they started singing songs and playing together as if it was phase 1 all over again. And one of the cutest parts of the story is when they got to ride home, they got to ride home in the same bus. So they were all riding on the same bus and they stopped for lunch. And some of the kids would buy malt milkshakes for the other kids that didn't have money with them so they could drink milkshakes together. It was so cute. It's adorable. I'm sorry. Science is not adorable. But anyway, what they concluded with, or at least what Sherif kind of gathered his ideas in conclusion of this whole thing, his finishing thoughts, were kind of making a parallel to world leaders at the time. Sherif was born in Turkey. He was born during a very tumultuous time for his country, and he had to flee. And around this time, around the time he was doing majority of his work on groups, he was doing it on the certain group that I guess you can't say because you'll get demonetized. I don't really give a shit about monetization, but that group, he was studying like how does that even come from anything? How are hateful groups kind of created, and where do these attitudes come from? So he was stating that he thought previous efforts of world leaders to go alone and meet with each other to calm intergroup conflict, just thinking that their influence, connection, and vibes are going to get them through the whole thing, is not effective for achieving harmony. And this was all the way in 1953. So he said what's effective for achieving harmony is the groups working together toward common ends, because that's when minds are changed and that's when behavior changes. I don't know. This is something to think about, but I guess we'll get into why it was unethical. Okay. When it comes to like it being unethical and the ethical concerns, it's not as like crazy or scandalous as I'll admit, I was hoping that it would be something messy and funny, but like this is real life. These were real kids. So it's good that nothing crazy was happening to them. Because when you hear about this entire experiment, and after I just went through everything, you wouldn't think that anything bad had went on. And to be fair, he wasn't really breaking any ethical code that he had, because there weren't any at the time that this took place. So while this study is considered unethical, it's not unethical because they violated any human rights laws or, psychologically destroyed these children. it was mainly because of a document that I used to have to read every damn day in grad school called the Ethical Principles of Psychologists and Code of Conduct. And is a code that breaks down like all the expectations, rights, regulations, and possible law-abiding rules that psychologists, psychology researchers, people writing anything about patients, or even within academia, the science in general, have to keep to, because it can get messy if you don't. I mean, it's ethics. So you want everything to be up to par with an ethical code, especially when it comes to informed consent, which is what this study kind of broke. Remember how I kept repeating that these boys did not know that they were in an experiment? That is a breach of informed consent, especially when it comes to informed consent for informed consent for research, and then there's recording people for research. That is like another thing. So he had hidden cameras everywhere, and had voice recorders in places to overhear what the boys were saying or doing while the counselors weren't around, because he wanted to make sure that the boys weren't acting differently just because counselors were around, which they weren't. But that was part of their like collection of information throughout the study, was that they had those devices, but the boys didn't know. The boys were not aware that they weren't aware of anything. And I think they didn't find out until 50 years or so later that they had even been part of it. They didn't know that Robbers Cave, one of them, they didn't know that that was what was going on. But they all had decent memories of it. So I guess, that's where it gets kind of weird, because it's like nothing malicious happened. And luckily there wasn't anything malicious going on. None of the kids got hurt. But if it was like a Lord of the Flies type deal where like they were in fisticuffs, okay, then that would just be like a different thing. Or if they had done something like the monster study where they traumatized these children, there would be something different to say. But as far as today's standards, like they weren't up to par with ethical stuff. And yeah, I don't know how do you end something like this? They didn't. This is dumb. Okay, be cool. I'll talk to you a different time.